I think we should begin. Sorry, there are some seats. There's some seats in the front here, and I think there are still one or two in the North Jury room. Maybe you just like standing. Okay, it's a very great pleasure to introduce Norman Klein to give a lecture here. I think it's the first time he's given a public lecture here. Many students have already attended the couple of lectures that he's given, which have sort of begun to, in a way, introduce students to the idea of the refeudalization of California on the one hand, and the specification of the way in which special effects work in cinema, and as the idea of special effects kind of work in the interface of cinema and architecture. I think his work is particularly kind of relevant at the moment in the AA, when there seems almost a necessity of students from units to talk in their general studies tutorials about, I want to work on, they used to say 3 or 4 years ago, I say, what do you want to do your thesis on? They'd say, oh, I'm interested in space. And that wasn't sort of terribly helpful. And you obviously realize after a while that what they say they're going to work on is not terribly helpful, but it may be quite indicative. And I've noticed in the last kind of 2 years that they've stopped, all of them, saying, I'm interested in space. And they've started saying, I'm interested in effects. Now, others around the building can, in a way, pick up the various heterogeneous sources on which this kind of discourse on the effect is coming. I think it's extremely good to have someone who talks so directly and is concerned with the mechanics of special effects which he produced this morning. But this evening I think Norman is going to speak about, in a sense, the work which has gone into the book, the new book, The Vatican to Vegas, a history of special effects. So I'll leave him to kind of define the precise scope of it. Norman is someone who was always too principled to finish his PhD or kind of enter the kind of system in the proper way, I mean, the way his mother would have liked. But that doesn't prevent him now being a critic and historian whose work is increasingly recognized in the States, and with its publication by Verso and others recognized in this country as, in a sense, the most sort of intuitively kind of grasping and kind of empirically referential work on these kinds of issues. He's concerned not only with how Virilio might think about it, but also with how Gates might think about it. It's a great pleasure to welcome Norman Klein. Thank you very much.
You can find the book after the lecture in future in Triangle Book.
Yeah, yes. Oh, yes. So the publisher's kind enough to have brought some books in. For the last 5 years, I've been on this art project, and it's very odd because I seem to be writing only about things I don't really want to do. You know, I don't really go to shopping malls. Not really. I'm really a slum kid. I miss the smell of bagels and so forth. But I've begun this process very carefully, as systematically as I know how, even though I'm not always very systematic. I tend to be very associative. I sort of go out like that. But I decided today I'll try to make some systematic notion as to what happened, because when I started the project it was going to be called something like the history of simulation, and the term simulation dissolved right away. It was almost useless to me because, first of all, the term interaction dissolved even faster, right? Because every time I shook hands with someone, I was having an interaction. So I found that the word interactive was sort of pathetic, to congratulate yourself, to notice that if you pushed a button, you could choose your own adventure. But it wasn't your adventure. It was your own adventure, that kind of thing. So the simulation model also didn't work because we have this notion of the procession of emptied signifiers, the Baudrillardian notion, and the collapse of the sign. And the more I researched from the evidence forward, I found that the sign wasn't collapsing. When I would talk with various designers or architects, when I would go back to earlier sources, when I would talk about these issues, they would say, "Oh, that's a plot point," or we know. It was like a phenomenon, a little perceptual blink that they understood. So this entire body of analysis was leading me nowhere. If I use that term simulation, it was just congratulating us for noticing the obvious. And then I would follow my son in his process, and I would notice that at the age of 8, he got it all. You know what I mean? So he was already a post-Baudrillardian at the age of 8, and as magnificent or poignantly malignant, right, as Baudrillard's critique may be, it just didn't work with the evidence. So I had to scrap that. Right? That was a loss. Right? So I was really in trouble. Then the word virtual. I thought, well, the word virtual would work. Well, I found virtual didn't work either because the virtual is always relative. That means the second time you see it, you've seen it differently. I was mentioning this morning how many examples of this exist throughout the history of the virtual. In other words, what was it like the first time someone saw a three-point perspective on a wall? Did it seem like the wall was melting? Oh, look, Hans, the wall is melting. And then they go back the second time. He said, it's not melting anymore. It just, it can only melt once. Second time it sort of melted. And then you began other issues. And as you began to read the various discourses from the 15th century forward, you began to realize that all the arguments were already in place by 1510 when the famous ceiling is up. And people are saying, well, that's not really Neoplatonic enough, I was reading this, oh my God, they already understood the so-called virtual model by 1510, had worked it through and already had a discourse on it, and were telling Michelangelo that it wasn't Neoplatonic enough, So virtual simply didn't survive. It was yet another complicated plot point, and it has to be relative to work, I discovered. So all this notion of make it more real, if they actually made it real enough, someone would probably say, I'll just go home. It's real there. I don't have to be here. And so there I was, right? So I went to the next step. So I became very aware that the research also continually rolled me back to the 16th and 17th centuries. That was very surprising for me. The design tropes and then other perverse links. The one that struck me is when I would take my son to the El Capitan movie theater in downtown Los Angeles, the one that Disney had dished up and they have people singing to you and so forth and showing the movies and so on. And I noticed that it had a Moorish, slightly Byzantine ceiling, with affects that in some very perverse, incredibly perverse way was really generated out of the 16th, 15th centuries. I thought, wow, it's getting worse, so it was getting more confusing because that means obviously they simply were flipping through the books century after century and doing something perverse yet again, from one period to the other. So there was something like the Renaissance to Disneyland. And when I'd interview people, I found that it wasn't a surprise to them either. That various designers knew about this. The classic example, when I was interviewing recently John Jurdy, Mr. City Walk and Mr. Rotterdam and everywhere else, as I mentioned, jobs in every continent except Antarctica. That's the description. and I was talking to him about the Fremont experience. And in the conversation, he said, yes, I just come back to see some paintings, anamorphic paintings in Italy when I was working on that. I thought, we could work that into Fremont Place, but I'm not sure if we could afford it. So we had to do something else. And he said, no, I'm not the Bernini of the, I'm the Borromini. Because Bernini hated Borromini, and they hate me. You know, basically that kind of thing. And then Steve Wynn, recently in the newspaper, said, no, he's the Bernini. He's the Bernini of Las Vegas, you know. So in the book, I've decided I'll bring Bernini back to life to really get a fair shot. I'm just going to bring him back to life and take him to Vegas, right? And let him go through the buffets for a couple days and get used to ketchup, and then have him design a casino. And my guess is within 2 weeks, he'll have an initial sketch. You know, it's just, you know, instead of salvation, it's gambling, you know, that kind of thing. So you understand that clearly one has to use older sources. But it's comforting to have these people to help you. I mean, Bernini is a nice resource. I'm comfortable with that. Or even books like this. I was showing you 17th century studies handbooks, already well scripted. Here's my favorite one: How to Transform a Man into a Rock. And then they have charts clearly on how to do it, and then analysis how to transform rocks into men. Right? The method of showing the sea, how to show a sea, or how to make clouds do this and that and other things. How to make ships or galleys or other vessels seem to move over the sea on stage. How to make the sea rise, swell, get tempestuous, and change color. It's extraordinary, clearly defined with terms like wonder, how to make wonder. And I would read it, and I realized they meant something very, very precise in these handbooks. They actually had already worked out a grammar. In fact, I'm even more and more convinced that Bernini was taking theatrical effects and putting them into these churches. You know, I mean, you have a carved church boxes, right? Staring at the ecstasy of a saint, right? It's very, very obvious that in a way Bernini was making movies, but that doesn't quite work either. So I wasn't entirely there, but I was getting along, right? Getting closer. Anyway, and so the idea of narrative architectural spaces, how the business is conducted, how to get to the diffuse yet highly centralized economy that we have, dominated by tourism, the digital, and media. It's a kind of digitalized mercantilism, I decided, you know, like Colbert's mercantilism, or a kind of Catholicity, like the Counter-Reformation is sort of similar to Disney, you know, that kind of thing. And I would go from there to find how the overlapping orbits of power work now and then and so forth. And that somewhere in the period between 1450 and let's say 1789, or perhaps as late as 1850, I would find that codes for special effects environments that would be more precise than these generic things. Oh, virtual, oh, it's interactive, oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, oh, God, I'm so brilliant. I've noticed it's not real, you know, but it really is there. I paid a lot of money for it, so it must really be there, you know. Look, they're on the Dow. They're making a lot of money, that sort of thing. So 3 forms seem to repeat the most. And I decided I would link these together. The first form that repeated, and I decided to use terms with these that were similar to digital technology, terms that were used in video games and so forth, just to protect me, so I wouldn't get too lost. So the first was obviously the dome. So I thought the dome was a form of immersion. That this strange relationship of the Pantocrator and the oculus, and the way one navigated the space, and the way Montaigne and Brunelleschi, shall we say, combined to invent the system, was in a way a kind of seemingly acentered space where you could find no clear foreground. And the absence of a clear foreground has a lot to do with a certain kind of special effects environment. So I felt, oh, this is wonderful. I mean, it's so obvious. And then when I'd mention it in lectures, people, architects or other people would say, so what? You know, I thought, well, that doesn't seem to be helping much. But I still had this sense of a tradition of a parabolic space that was still useful to study. Well, that was one, okay? The second one was the arcade, because, yes, I've read the same material you all have, right? poor Walter Benjamin trudging through Paris, saying they'll never publish me. I'm Jewish, and, and then taking Baudelaire's reminiscences of his sort of physical ailments, walking through Paris in some ironic way, talking about the dawdling effect, right? And saying, oh, I'm just a flaneur, and making me, and then now everyone's a flaneur. Every academic goes on holiday, they flanerize, right? Whatever the verb would be. So I thought I would impress them with talking about, well, it's a basilica for shopping, right? It's always mirroring back and so forth, and then the kind of jump cut effect of all the windows and so forth. And they said, oh, we know that. I said, what do you think, we're idiots? Please, I can understand it. Then the third one I used very, very randomly. I called it the labyrinth because I noticed that Piranesi's Carceri had been repeated again and again, cinematically and in other ways, and were also being, shall we say, scanned in and used in various digital effects. And when I mentioned labyrinth, that was the most electric moment. First I mentioned it at a lecture at Microsoft, which is strange in itself. And then all of a sudden, 3 people stood up and finished the lecture for me, and then emailed me on all the labyrinths that they knew. And I realized, my God, this labyrinth, what is... So obviously this was, shall we say, a keeper, right? So I decided I put that aside, right, and maintain the englobed immersive space as a tradition, and then I would keep the other material, the arcade, as an obvious issue, that somehow in the course of parabolic spaces as opposed to arcaded spaces, you come up with some reality, and that one, shall we say, is an accelerator and one slows you down. That makes sense. In other words, when you have a domed space in a shopping mall, for example, everyone stops and they go to the food court, right? And then when you have the tube to be, an egomaniac and get your Visa card out, then that's serious business, right? And then in effect, an arcade is like a movie where you pay when you leave, that sort of thing, and you're the movie, So it became very, very clear. I also had been looking the wrong way. I'd been looking at the spaces and their design. I hadn't realized what it was. The key was not in the spaces or how illusionistic they were or weren't, or how ornamented they were or weren't. No, the key was very, very obvious. The key was in the narrative that was received, right? I mean, a basic semiotic issue, that I should stop studying the nature of how illusionistic the spaces were and get to the real business, which was the narrative of the audience itself. That was the key. So I invented a term for that, and that term did rather well. In studying the space between, to study the audience, the player, the parishioner, and also to make a careful distinction between the design, right, and the intentions of the client, shall we say, and then the reception of the viewer or player or parishioner or whoever it is, right, because they never matched. I became it's like a kinetic sign system. We're just going three speeds at once, right? So I came up with 2 terms that proved the most useful, and I thought I'd concentrate on those. One obviously was the labyrinth, right? And then the other was scripted spaces. There was even a conference this year on scripted spaces. People came from the film industry and from UCLA architecture to discuss the merits of the term, and one person stood up at the end of the conference to say, well, obviously no one seems to really understand what it means. And I said, no, I just made it up. And I was just curious to see what people thought it meant. And then she kind of looked at her notes, and it became confusing for a moment, right? So obviously that's another keeper, shall we say, right? So scripted spaces is rather important. But scripted spaces should be seen as a mode of inquiry, because obviously a well-scripted bathroom could be that. Anything could be a scripted space. Feng shui in Chinese, architectural design or whatever. But a scripted space is clearly where the entrance and the exits are pre-assigned, and the sense that these are spaces clearly to be navigated, that the viewer's story is supposed to be unfolding there, right? That the story should somehow seem different for each person. At least that's the theory, not necessarily the practice. Is Disneyland a scripted space? Yes, but it depends on how you feel. I mean, when I went to Disneyland, it was horrifying for me. I spent a whole weekend one time as part of my research. I went to Disneyland Hotel, the happiest place on earth. I was going in diabetic shock. You know, I was so fed up with happiness. And then I finally went to the shower and decided I would scrub off all this happiness. And then I looked between the bubbles, and Mickey was still smiling at me in the soap. So it's a matter of, but my son had a wonderful time. He had a wonderful time, the lines and so forth. So it's a matter of taste, obviously. But something built into the architectural design, very obviously. So I decided I had to say scripted spaces with illusionistic effects where the audience is a central character. That became my model. Scripted spaces with illusionistic effects where the audience became a central character. And then I need one more restriction, because if you're a central character to the narrative, what's the story about? I mean, someone's going to ask, well, Norman, okay, fine. So what's the I mean, is there a story then? I mean, what did they sit around and go through a kind of narrative sublime? You know, what is it about? So I decided, in a sense, the narrative is always about power, the give and take of authority. What authority the player relinquishes, then what the player pretends to have control over, this kind of trade-off. It's a ritualized version of free will against predetermination, you know? It's sort of Weberian consumerism, you might say. Whatever, right? Obvious examples are the Baroque church itself and the casino, so the Vatican to Vegas, you see. And then the video game, clearly an example, video game. People, for example, in the video game, the average length that it takes for a person to get the, shall we say, the hand motor coordination so that they can actually kill the creatures or go to level 7 or whatever it is, or get to the end of Myst and realize it's a junior adult novel. It's kind of an insulting story, right? That kind of thing. Whatever it might be, or the internet, you know, trying to finally master that it's mostly advertising anyway, that kind of thing. And that you'll never get the keyword to work for you, you know. And the browser's, you know, going to crash in 30 seconds, you know, that kind of thing. But why do people stay then? See, that was the question for me. Why do people stay in a game when they've already mastered it? I was watching my son play SimCity and build cities with, you know, 750,000 people squashed into 2 square miles, you know, these kind of cities. You can build them over and over and over again with this very strange reading of modernist urban planning in one of its most perverse formats, you know, because they list all the books that they used to design this, and it's like a bit terrifying. But then I remember he downloaded information on secrets, on how to, and he knew how to cheat. He knew how to cheat. He knew that if he did this, they would never fire him. And if he did that, he could lie. And he could swindle. It's like cheating the father. I think it's a very gendered male thing, Mark, I would say. You know, of course, the whole digital culture is gendered male, I would say. And so, in effect, it was a kind of a labyrinth, what I call happy imprisonment. You know, that sort of thing. And I could read some material from it to give you a sense of the background. So I'll read some material on the labyrinth. This is a short essay, but I think it's straightforward enough that it should be fluid for our purposes. Anyway, I'll start, and then I'll interrupt myself, as I always do. Recently, this was about 2 years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, so I've evolved since then, but I think it's straightforward enough for the time we have. Recently, branching systems on the internet have been called labyrinths, a nod to Borges' writing, but even more to the tradition of ecstatic revelation associated with medieval labyrinths. You see them, you search out labyrinth on the web, and it's like you're supposed to, you know, convert, you know. The mystification troubles me. We don't need holistic nonsense about what is little more than fancy corporate telephones, in a way, at least as of then and still. We're at a dangerously nascent stage for the internet and so forth. Net surfing is not revelation, even when you download the mystic geometry of the 7-pointed Greek labyrinth or compare search engines to the labyrinthine walks of medieval ecstatics. In the earlier times, labyrinths were designed deceptively, a trackless path of blind alleys that was very pleasant inside. Rest stops were provided, or a bench at a dreary corner to break the sense of feeling trapped. Then in stages, the blindness would clear, and the traveler would discover secrets, gaining revelation, the imagery associated with revelation. That was essentially the role labyrinths played for the church during the Middle Ages and for the nobility of Europe as late as the 18th century, made of hedges, drawings, and sculpture. I'm sure many of you have seen these, so I'm probably just preaching to the choir by repeating it. Huh? In effect, they were broken circles for walking. Labyrinths provided a condensed pilgrimage with straightforward rules to make the passage enlightening. Yeah. So why would this be a model for the computer? Huh? They were intellectual challenges, not simply theatrical immersions. Often the hedges were barely ankle high, and the floor plan was usually easy to map with the eye. Some labyrinths were made of mosaics and so forth. Some had rutted turf. Some were very, very shallow. Right? The sojourner would know beforehand whether there were single or multiple entrances, how the helixes would operate, and so on. Knowing the map helped one walk faster, but the map was only a guide. So now we begin to get closer to the notion of the digital, right? The mapping skill. It was not designed to be the mystery itself. One had to navigate to find the mystery. What the Germans would call the Bildung, right? The educational passage. Right? The journey was a compact mode of discovery, like walking through a text. They always would be shorter, right? They'd be smaller than life itself, and yet they contain life. Right? As if a story you might be able to slip into your pocket. The labyrinth was a miniature version of a vast pilgrimage. It was a kit, a kind of pocket reliquary, a bag of relics for armchair tourists. So now we're getting warm, right? Here we are. We're in the mall now, right? We can just feel it coming, right? The Renaissance inherited this precise architectural tradition of the labyrinth, and the form has been passed down to us through romantic imagery as in movies, advertising, computer games. The labyrinth was originally an interactive journey with many subplots. All of it could be managed in a single room, on a single sheet of paper, on an acre of land. Over the centuries, the garden and heraldic labyrinths inspired metaphors in literature, usually in one or two variations. A single person's maze-like passage was one, but I particularly like the Spanish version, the 17th century and since, that the labyrinth was when everyone met at one place who couldn't talk to each other. So you could have a labyrinth where you went just yourself in a maze, or when everyone made your life a maze. You became amazed, right? That kind of thing. Shelley described Venice as a peopled labyrinth of walls, right? Dante's Inferno and Coleridge's caverns measureless to man have been studied as labyrinth systems. Mexican zocolos, the Dome of St. Peter's, and so on, right? So as opposed to the internet, architectural models remind us that while labyrinths taught revelation, they also taught political humility, right? If only how to bow obediently what noblemen passed. For example, the famous labyrinth, Le Notre's labyrinth at Versailles, the one that was destroyed before the revolution. It was just like someone said, I'm fed up with this, I can't. Well, I don't even know why it was destroyed, but it was torn down, wasn't it? The paths through the maze were pre-assigned, am I correct, according to social rank. Do we have people who have studied it? There's a long article on it. It's rather interesting that I found. The nobility had a special path through the labyrinth, fountain by fountain, allegory by allegory, that would lead to gloire, right? Which meant a military myth that honored feudal rank. And then the middle class, they couldn't find gloire, because they didn't have the right for gloire. Gloire wouldn't work for them. So they needed a separate route that taught them honesty, to know their place in the greater order, probably to find investment money to help the king build more Versailles, right? Labyrinth design over the past 500 years profoundly resembles what is built in mass media today. A bizarre mutation, of course, malls, casinos, and so forth. But Renaissance Baroque labyrinths are also warnings to us. We should force ourselves to stay alert to what is at stake. It may be a cute computer maze. It may be Mickey hugging you, right? It may be anything at all, right? Maybe just something like getting lost in the web. But it packs a wallop. It helps to police malls, to keep players at slot machines. We also need a vocabulary to understand the significance of a labyrinthine design. Too many words enhance this false mystery, so I attack the word virtual. Even the word postmodern troubles me. Why would you deconstruct the disembodied, I mean, it's already not there, on some level. And yet, it's so profoundly important, but we have to return to the objects, I think. Labyrinths are rigidly coded, they're not dissolving. They have a sharp point, and we're essentially on the end of it. Right? What's more, we are meant to enjoy feeling like a stuck pig, right? The sensation apparently is worth the price, or else you wouldn't pay. Of course, we don't. None of us, right? We're all immune to this. But I've discovered that all of us have some version of this new scripted space environment that we like. We're not supposed to admit it, but we're none of us immune, I think, in a way. The contemporary labyrinthine experience is user-friendly alienation. Don't be lonely. Flick that remote, right? The remote is a labyrinth, don't you think? 200 channels, flip, 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 right? They're all terrible, but you have the mute, so you have control, right? You can change channels, but you can program nothingness into nothingness, but you go on. I'm sure all of us at one time or another in looking for old movies, at least that's what I do in the United States, because I'm obsessed with old black and white movies. I grew up seeing a lot of them on television, so I can stand it. But I find myself sometimes spending 15 minutes, noticing some Iranian soap opera and other things going around and around and around. What have I done? Why am I doing this? Don't I know it's crap? Don't I know it's garbage? I mean, I know it's garbage. And somehow I feel I have control because of this mute. I have infinite choice and no way out, right? And yet I'll stay on it. So obviously remote control is one example, clearly. Cheerfully, the confusion is intended by the designer. I'll give you, well, I won't go with that. Let me read this first. I'm jumping out of myself here. Designers understand that the player wants to submit to the loss of control if he or she feels safe enough. See, safe enough, that's very important. How much safety, how much surveillance is the proper amount for this mall? It's a very big deal in the United States. How much surveillance do people want? Do they want someone to walk by and show their guns? Some places they're supposed to display their weapons. In some places they're supposed to hide behind a pole, or even in Disneyland they have to dress up as if they're just visiting. So it's a very delicate balance, isn't it, to what will make you stay inside this labyrinth game, very clearly. Let's see. Labyrinths are primarily scripted spaces, more specifically spaces scripted with illusionistic effects. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that labyrinths are the only example I found. They're just one that stands out. There are many, many examples that wouldn't fit as labyrinths that can be called scripted spaces. It's just, this one seems to be the one that continually makes people smirk. When I mention it to designers, I say, oh, the labyrinth, you get the idea? Oh, yes. Like that. I can say, oh, yes, I've got that idea very, very clearly. I understand. So you get this feeling, oh, my God, it's more than I thought, right? To track the design of labyrinth systematically, we should follow the spectator more than the gimmickry. Fancy effects come and go, but a scripted space is designed for its bottom 20 feet, that classic definition, that you only, at the bottom 20 feet, like from the Ringstrasse to wherever, that kind of thing. The player browser navigates the space as a central character in a story, which may be about Catholic doctrine in the Vatican or slot machines in a casino, but all such stories rely upon illusionism and cheerful alienation, right? I sometimes call it ergonomic fascism, Gee, it's fun. I have no hope, Let's play some more. I mean, it's that, gee, I don't feel upset at all. I don't feel alone at all now. It's strange. To feel this authoring, to feel magical, the script must be at the right temperature, like air conditioning. It's funny you mentioned air conditioning yesterday, and here it is in the text. Not too much, just enough to make the player feel comfortable, awed, faintly lost, but enchanted. Too much visible surveillance is good for some spaces, bad for others. Successful recreational spaces must avoid tensions about social class and keep the mood genteel. And then there are all these different examples. Some of them look old already. Well-scripted spaces are supposed to feel very cynical in their design. It's all right for them to be cynical somehow. At the worst, it can be an ergonomic fascism. At the best, a good resort, like Disneyland. And they're meant to be a little sloppy, like a comfortable pair of shoes, Cheerfully slipshod, but upscale. Always upscale, if possible, right? In other words, I don't think we'll have a theme park about poverty. Don't try it. I don't think you'll find someone who'll pay for it, They're a happy swindle. You're supposed to get 9 cents back on every dime. It's a slot machine, although the odds of beating a scripted space are slim to none. when I interview people who are dealing with, who go to casinos a lot, right? I said, well, you're going to lose. I said, of course, but you go back. I like to, right? And he said, why? I said, no, 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 you don't understand. And they always lean over and said, I can lose slowly. See? I've heard them say things like, it only cost me about $6 an hour to lose. What's $6 an hour? You know, bottle of wine is, and they go through all these theories, and then they feel comfortable. I feel good for them, Maybe they're right, I mean, it makes sense, right? Let's see what else. Most of all, in summary, scripted spaces are configured as narrative journeys. The audience becomes a central character to the story. Brunelleschi, Mantegna, obvious examples, SimCity, Doom, Myst, casinos, amusement parks, even Futurama, which I'm sure you have all studied endlessly. This sense of control, right? But I guess the modernist sense of control seems more extreme than our new version, which seems to let you sort of pick and choose, or these interactive museums where you choose which part of the script you want and so forth. There are all sorts of versions. And to navigate through the narrative, the player enters an immersive, illusionistic scripted space. By immersive, I mean englobed, curved domes, or parabolic things lit atmospherically. By illusionistic, I mean forced perspective, anamorphosis, trompe l'oeil, gimmicks like miniaturization to affect our sense of scale. But most of all, the central problem is power, epic tourism, a shopper's revenge. One relinquishes control in order to join the labyrinth. Inside, one has seemingly infinite choice, but practically no way out. No one prefers being trapped. One prefers being trapped, sorry. That gives the story its bite. Why is such happy imprisonment fun for many? Because one slowly catches one's breath. One expects to outwit the program. For example, in City Walk, I talked with Jurdy about City Walk. City Walk, that outdoor mall that sort of is shall we say, a walkthrough parody of Los Angeles in a condensed form. And he showed me the information and so forth. And then I interviewed people at MCA who ran it, right? And I said, well, how do you work this place? And he said, oh, don't you see it's curved? I saw it's curved between the two places where you want to make money. The movie theaters, the theme park. The movie theaters, theme park. The movie theaters, the theme park. So we don't make money off of the leases. They pay, or they go out of business. Then we find a new lease, right? Movie theaters, theme park. I said, well, how do you keep people from feeling, well, a little bit manipulated? and I said, oh, wherever the curve gets a little bit too much, you put in hot spots so they can sit. We put in a little piece of a bench, but not a big bench. A bench where they can just sit for a while because we wanted to go from movie theater to theme park. Yeah. So it's all very carefully done. So I noticed that they had not so much benches as places where you could lean, where they would have like a potted plant or something. So, oh boy, well, got to go to the movie theater, right? Theme park. Now I'm not saying that it's successful, right? But the intentions are clear, right? Now, they're not going to say, hello, we're trying to get your money to make you go to all these places, but they will allow you to get a sense of the manipulation, but also to get a sense that maybe it has some sloppiness to it. I'll give you one anecdote to explain. In a casino in Reno, Nevada, right? I went to the casino and I spoke to, interviewed the architect, and I said, I noticed you spent a lot of money in this sort of restaurant bar. I mean, these are expensive. Oh, a lot of money. The woods look very, they're very, that sort of thing. So, are they cherry? Oh, they're mahogany. And I said, well, then why do you have this incredibly crappy mural right next to it? I mean, respectfully, I didn't want to tell him what I thought of the Bernini Triton fountain in the middle of it. Down the corner there, I thought, whoa. But it doesn't work for me. But everyone else is saying, "Oh, look, a fountain that looks Italian," kind of thing. Then there's a little pasta place nearby. So I understood that worked for whoever it was. But the issue that struck me is why this incredibly substandard mural next to this remarkably, well-appointed sort of Victorian tea room effect. So he said, "Oh, don't you know what that is? We call that junking up." You mean there's a name for, what do you mean by, and then he explained, and I said, well, let me repeat so I understand what you say. The impression I'm getting is that you're aware of the fact that this is not a remarkable mural. Oh, yes, it's crap. Yeah, basically, he said. I said, so you put that next to the other so that it looks unfinished, incomplete. So in that sense, it looks as if perhaps the odds might be unfinished or incomplete. So people have a sense that they might find some loose spot, sort of like hot spots that are put in the computer sometimes for you to locate. Does that sound familiar? I can see someone's looking. Yeah. And he said, oh, yes, that's about it. I thought, whoa, yeah. That's, so they've been working on this. They've noticed, because they would check every 20 or 30 feet in a casino regularly, and they found that sometimes the spaces that looked unfinished did fine. You see? So I'm not saying this is a science, but I'm saying it's a narrative, right? And it's definitely a coded narrative. It's not the collapse of the sign. That's damn certain. I mean, it's a sign system that's continually being adjusted. So we really have to be alert to that. And I suspect architects are extremely alert to that on some level or another. Let's see. Let's see what else. I mentioned that. A good special effects game, for example, should be a thieves' paradise, and is so by design. Pockets of confusion are put in. It's a Faustian simulated bargain. See? It's really cute, because there's nothing really at stake. You're not going to lose your soul, just another 20 minutes, because time is going to keep you in the game, and that therefore makes the game more valuable. In fact, SimCity was called, they have something in SimCity they called the chaos variable. They actually have a name for it. Chaos is, in effect, your opponent. So you find elements of chaos to work with. So they try to give the impression that there's a point of chaos or lack of control. Holes are built into programs so people can download secrets and so on. So the player submits to the labyrinth, then pretends to cheat. That sort of thing. And let's see what else. A cross between ergonomic fascism. I'm being redundant here. Oh, actually, here's one interesting example. When I was a child, I grew up in Coney Island at a point when Coney Island was pretty grotesque, but I loved it. The stink seemed wonderful to me. I walk around eating my knish, with all the special cheese flavorings in it and so forth. And then underneath I'd hear women screaming and howling, and I'd say, Dad, oh, no. So what they seem to be screaming down there, or panting or something. He said, no. I said, oh, okay. So I'd walk along, and then we'd go toward the cyclone, and next to the cyclone was, which was one of the early rides. There would be the bobsled. So, and then everyone would always mumble something about the bobsled. I said, once in a while. I said, what? Every so often. What? Well, someone would. Well, it's turned over. I said, well, what happened? He said, not good. He would get injured. I said, you mean like dying? Sort of finishing my knish. I said, oh yes, dying. Well, we don't know. So then I got sort of interested when relatives would come by to visit in Coney Island, and we'd walk by the bobsled and the cyclone, you see? And so people would say, well, let's go take a ride, right? And then everyone said, the cyclone, one of the first classic, Coney Island rides. They sort of say the allegorization of the train, of the subway, of everything that represents the city. I said, maybe a cyclone. And then someone would always turn around and say, and there'd be this Kafkaesque silence afterward. They would say, but what about the bobsled? And there'd be this kind of pause. Do you know what I mean? Because the bobsled was not simulated death. The bobsled was really some degree of risk. It's kind of like the Clint Eastwood line, do you feel lucky today? That kind of thing. And it was always interesting as an early reminder that how safe it has to be for you to feel that you can cheat, and what safety represents. And safety having to do with class, having to do with a kind of clean environment, So one would say, in the parlance of the 1950s, where was Big Brother when you needed him? Anyway, entering a labyrinth is like arm wrestling with a parent or with an angel while God watches. Labyrinths are in reality carefully controlled spaces, not open-ended at all. They provide us with a theological replay of childhood. The parent is the program itself, the apparatus that gives you the magic. So no matter how naive the script, a hug from Goofy, whatever it might be, a wink from Barney, whatever it is now. It's fundamentally a picaresque about a godlike apparatus, a mountain god that cannot be violated and always stays encrypted. And it's getting worse and worse because the encryptions now include corporate wars. I purchased an IBM computer which is encrypted against a Microsoft, and I have a Microsoft email, and they made war on my machine, and it took me 23 hours, and I had to bring someone for 9 hours, and they kept crashing each other because inside the machine, inside this godlike parent labyrinth, they were strangling me. Because information is not a public utility, so therefore they'll do anything they want. So we have to realize the paradox of the labyrinth is growing, because as information gets more complex, it also is going to get more fragile. As it gets more fragile, it becomes more, shall we say, interconnected. As it gets more interconnected, the fragility makes it more dangerous. We're getting screwed, in effect, if I can be blunt. Leave the labyrinth for a moment and indicate, the nature of what is happening. So while we're having fun playing with our remote control, we should remember there's a reason why it's called remote control, Remote, very, very remote, control, increasingly more remote. Understand also, as it gets more ergonomic, user-friendly, you become farther and farther, you become, shall we say, a player who is unable to program. The farther you're away from programming, the farther you are from actually controlling. So therefore, the more friendly the control seems to be, the farther you are from actually controlling it. Now, to that degree, one can apply it to architecture as well and many other things. So scripted spaces represent a kind of paradox, but also a syndrome that I think is going to be more increasingly dangerous or awkward or ironic. And I say this because I really feel that many times our complaints are too innocent. We don't complain about what's really wrong. I remember talking about some of my complaints one time to someone who just came back, a Russian. He said, "You're complaining about what? Some new Starbucks, some latte down the corner? Go to Moscow." Then you'll learn how to complain. Your complaints are too shallow, right? What we should understand is what we're dealing with is franchise capitalism on a level of integration that's enormous and has a kind of seeming innocence to it that makes it more difficult for us to locate that we're watching the institutionalization of a fairly wide class structure. And this class structure doesn't appear to be narrowing, and the realities behind it appear to be growing. So we're not in the worst of all possible worlds. I think bubonic plague was worse, I think being in the trenches in World War I was worse. Many things are worse, but this is our problem, right? So, we can be a happy hostage, as I call it, right? Because I make a living, obviously, being a happy hostage. Well, look, we're trapped, that kind of thing. And everyone laughs, But we have to have some savagery to our critique, don't we? We have to find what it is we really honestly want to, shall we say, alter, critique, describe even, that sort of thing. Anyway, labyrinths are a profoundly corrupt game. I'd like to see, actually my version is, I'd like to see more labyrinths about corruption itself. Every art form has its self-reflexive devices, poetry, music. But the computer, oddly enough, survives mostly as a highly formalized tool of entertainment, and also the slickest telephone Jules Verne could have imagined. The telephonic, or telematic as they call it, it's just extraordinary. The entire format cries out for a good hatchet across the forehead, in a way, don't you think? So what would hatchet be? I don't know. I'm still waiting for a game that actually bankrupts you, where you're, oh my God, it worked. It was a bobsled after all, that kind of thing. Well, how about a Blade Runner simulation that brings real replicants into your neighborhood? Or a game called Job Search, in which you hire assassins to murder people who have better resumes. I just had all. As Tristram Sharp wrote 80 years ago, the world needs an operation, that sort of thing. He didn't mean it literally, of course, we know. That's a warning, too. We shouldn't be too careful, because, his name was Sammy Rosenstock, a nice, gentle, Jewish mathematician in the making who was sent there to avoid the war and just decided to become the Dadaist instead. Speaking culturally, at least, we should make more omelets out of this nonsense. I suggest that we build really leaky labyrinths, because under all the disembodied marvels, all the fluff lies our actual future, as real as a car hurtling downhill without brakes. So I have this notion, you call the manufacturer and say, the brakes, they're no good. You know, I'm going to hit the wall, and you always get the same answer on the phone, right? Oh, hello. Are you going to hit the wall? Oh, don't worry. The new software will fix it, you know? I mean, what a strange thing. We're waiting for the new software to fix it. Why should the new software fix it? The old software put us there. The new software is going to accelerate it, very likely, you know? Anyway, I had other... How much time? Am I running out of time? How much time would you say? 5 minutes. Oh, my God. I had all these slides and other things. I've gone so far. What should I... I'll tell you what. I'll show you some of the slides that represent the areas that this kind of analysis tends to be interesting to people. Oh, wait, what do I... Oh, do I push forward? No. I push forward. I see forward on projector 1. Oh, 2. Okay. Obvious one, right? Uh-oh, I think that's backwards, though. No, that's correct. Yes. What strikes me about this very briefly is, we know what this is. It's from the Carceres. It was 1760, I guess, is when they were finished. But you have all these descriptions by, when De Quincey saw it, he thought it represented an opium dream. When Eisenstein, you know, had material like this in his apartment, and he even has sketches of how he'd like to have shot it. It's interesting to understand that the labyrinth is also, shall we say, a construction of the self, of the psyche. It has all sorts of multiple meanings, and we should understand that it's different in film. I'm talking now about walk-through spaces. If you build a labyrinth in a film, it works very differently than it does in a walk-through space. That labyrinth is basically my shorthand for talking about the phenomenon, not necessarily the reality of it. There are all sorts of applied meanings. It's very important for us not to start shutting down the system before we begin our mode of address. You know, we have to. This is only a beginning. It better be a beginning, or else we're in bad shape, I think. Yeah. Let's see what else I have. Oh, I better get my list of slides to impress you with my efficiency here. So I have my list. Here we go. Okay. Well, this is the obvious one, right? Mantegna, the Ducal Palace in Mantua, right? The little cherub peeing on you, that kind of feeling, right? And always photographed to make it look like a painting rather than to deal with the complexity of it. But as many of you know, the sheer layering impact of the dome system, and then the way it then becomes part of the way residences are built in the 18th century, and how it evolves, and then finally, in a way, is short-circuited by these huge symphony halls and other kinds of residences in the 19th century, becomes more like stylized, right? Still offers 300 years, again, of very complex discourse, from theater to architecture, that are applicable today. For example, there is no term for what it feels like to be in a movie set. However, trompe-l'oeil is perfectly adequate, you see. There is no term to describe, let's say, the opening shots of various films sometimes, like where you don't know quite what it is, or like the credits opening to a film like Seven, but anamorphosis works very, very well. So we're sort of looking for instructive parallels, and it's very important that we make clear to ourselves how they work, and how they work now, and how they work then. So I'll just race along. Oh, then of course, Bernini, right? Sant'Andrea al Quirinale, right? 1658. It was done. Well, it took him a long time to do it. This is one that struck me. It struck me, but it seems to not. Oh, sorry. We seem to. Oh, I guess Bernini. I told you I'm going to bring him back. See, he fell right into the machine. He's just waiting. You know. Oh, okay. Shall I push it now? Oh no, not yet. Also, another issue is cybernetics, and I don't know if many of you made a study of cybernetics, but we have to understand that we're dealing with a culture based on feedback. It's very, very important side of it too. Ooh, I guess not. Well, not to worry. I'll go as quickly as I can, and I guess I can't go too quickly though. Well, I was since you're architects, you probably know about Balthasar Neumann's the Episcopal residence. Oops, here we go. I'm ready. Ready when you are. No, we're not ready. Oh, there it is, right? I looked at this and I found that very curious. It's finished around, well, it takes a long time to build, but my guess is by the 1720s it was essentially finished, and then the ceiling was added later, right? But if you understand that Tiepolo, who did the ceiling, and Balthasar Neumann, who constructed, who was the architect for the interior and for the whole place, what Tiepolo noticed was that if you walked in different directions up the stairs, and if you stood in different places, the narrative would change. So he designed the trompe-l'oeil and the entire ceiling as a walk-through experience. And I don't know whether it's the most successful or least successful, but it certainly is, shall we say, a clear example of a kind of labyrinth space of another sort, because standing right at the top in the center would, of course, be the bishop himself would say, yes, you can come in. No, you can leave now. You know, I mean, it's about presence and power at all times. Oh, wow, we seem, what? One. Oh, one. Oh, you're on one now. Oh, sorry. We've moved. And then this is part of the ceiling. This is Apollo bringing Beatrice, you know, from Dante's Inferno. From inside, sorry, Dante's Inferno. But another example that strikes me, interestingly, is the Galleria of Umberto I in Naples. And suddenly you realize, oh, Mike, there's a parallel in the design elements, right? And it's just sort of interesting to deal with the allusions, the allegorical references. That's a subject in itself, but you can begin to see strange rediscoveries of how scripts work. In this case, at the base is the movie theater, you know, that kind of thing. I'm moving just quickly. This is a shorthand to just point out the obvious, but maybe it's of some value to do it quickly. Then, of course, the Crystal Palace, the Hall of the Zollverein in 1851. There's your dome again, saying something else. And here's oh my God, that looks like a mall, doesn't it, right? And there's the entrance to the transept in 1851. Obvious points, you know. But the combination already of various forms of immersion and arcade. And then, of course, the Galerie d'Orléans in Paris, one of the earlier of these shopping malls, right? Arcades, you know, these spaces to keep you out of the rain between major streets in Paris. You know, that became the model for, shall we say, the shopping arcade. And I'm interested in the Burlington arcade also. I love the fact that on the second floor apparently it had prostitution. You know, so you can walk down, up and down, look at the clients. Then, of course, the notion of European fairgrounds, when these become, shall we say, mobile and compressed, and how these traditions alter and find their way into odd forms. I'm sure this is familiar to you. I'll just go quickly to stay within my 5 minutes as much as possible. The peacock scenery, 1923. I mean, you begin to notice all sorts of odd things, what they thought it was, how the movement was supposed to operate. You begin to realize, God, I've been walking past these images for decades, and I don't even understand how much they have to say or fail to say. And then the memory theater of Grillo Camillo, which I'm sure is known to many of you, right? When I mentioned this to impress people at Microsoft, they said, oh, fine. And they took out their library on memory theater, hundreds of dollars of books stacked up with that they were studying, because this is clearly one of the answers to understanding how to go from the Renaissance mechanistic notion of memory to, shall we say, this more cybernetic idea of memory. They got the point. The point is, have we gotten the point? It's our turn now. Oh, and then, anamorphosis, just a reminder, right? There are lots of, Brothers Quay made a documentary on this, and it's used a lot in cinematic language, even on MTV, to my horror, right? Now, I'm not trying to glorify these people, oversimplify. It just means that that the world has evolved, and this other shoe that everyone was saying might drop, might not drop, it dropped and they lost it, I mean, it's long since dropped, and it's time for us to understand the complexity and begin to bring complexity back in. I don't necessarily mean Venturian notions of complexity. I'm prepared to, I realize I can't use that term casually here. And then, let's see, Liszewski, Tale of Two Squares, quite fascinating to play with, because the idea of book design is very, very interesting, and the layering of book design. This is 1922. This children's book, a Cubo-futurist children's book. Oh, let me go fast here. And then everyone's seen this image, but did you know that this image from Liszewski was an electromagnetic puppet show? What the hell was that, right? In 1925, Liszewski says, what if we had an electromagnetic library, right? What would that look like? You begin to understand why the 20s, particularly the Soviet 20s, become so important for us. Let me try another. I'm sorry to race through. Please excuse my breathless rushing here. I'm trying to do this. This is Rodchenko's designs for Man with a Movie Camera. So also in advertising of the 20s, and various uses of Neue Sachlichkeit to Russian productivism, constructivism. There's a lot that hasn't been taken up by just Frank Gehry, There's still room, there's still room for more. And then this was mentioned in a chat the other day, Raymond Hood's fantasy models, the project for polyvalent skyscraper in Manhattan. I have to warn you that once you go into this analysis, almost like psychiatric, I suppose, the way I'm describing it, once you work this way, the modern and the postmodern dissolve. There's no distinction between more or less ornamentation as to whether it's more or less scripted. None whatsoever. In other words, the modernist era of design, the modernist era in architecture takes us straight shot all the way through. It's no surprise that science fiction borrows from this, because the connections between, shall we say, a stripped down space that you enter, and a space that has lions and tigers and Goofy or whatever, that the separation is not nearly as extreme as you would imagine, because you're watching the narrative itself. So if you study the narrative, you don't come up with this distinction. In fact, postmodernism has drifted farther and farther back. It's now somewhere in the Rococo period for me. I can't seem to stop. It keeps drifting back. Well, I'm going too fast, I guess. Then, it's not a curious one also. You find curiosities here. Speed cars, from a fair in 1947. I mean, does that look like New York to you a little bit? I mean, you begin to come up with curious connections that you have to begin to resolve in other ways. And then the Dadists. We don't want to forget the child carburetor, Picabia, right? All the strange language of critique that we see in Dadaism. That's very exciting to people I work with. And then curious notions, talk about scopophilia, right? The dark room, 1935 in Los Angeles. Yeah. This was a store, right? Here's one I like. Oh, the Jungle Ride, right? Disneyland. I went there in the very late 60s. A man, there was an anti-war activist running the Jungle Ride, right? And he was telling everyone, he was re-scripting it for everyone, talking about scenes from the Tet Offensive, right? And then afterward, I remember him saying, as people were leaving the Jungle Ride, he said, now you can get off your big, fat, green cushions, right? And I just had a feeling he wasn't there for very long. But it's another reminder of the complexity of this. Now, I also have interviewed the people who designed the Pirates of the Caribbean, and one of the ironies of that very clearly was that when I asked them, well, you worked on all these animated features on Bambi and all these other things and Pinocchio. He said, oh yes, I'm one of the 9 old men, as they call them. And he said, so how did you design the Pirates of the Caribbean as a scripted space? differently than you would like an animated cartoon. He said, what do you mean? I mean different. He said, no difference. I just imagine people as cartoons. I said, well, then how did they design it? Oh, the same. I thought, wow, you know, I mean, we have underestimated the impact of other forms of cinema and its relationship to Disneyland, which is one of the models. So Disneyland is an interesting case study, without question. Still remains that. Oh, then I like this one. This is cute. Venice in the snow, right? The murals. This is Venice, California. See, this is the odd sort of trompe-l'oeil murals. So I thought I'd end with something like that. Oh, but not sideways. I'll go on to the next one. This one particularly is cute. This is, I'll end with this. This is Farmer John's packing house, where they make pork sausages. And on the side of it, they call it the Hog Heaven mural, right? So when you drive by, you imagine all these cheerful pigs, right? Heading on their way, right, to their reward in your stomach, right? That sort of thing. So it's just a reminder of the eccentricities of all of this. Anyway, I've outlasted my time, and thank you for showing up, and we'll try to imagine the future together. Thank you.
Can we answer some questions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure. I didn't know what the system was. Well, yes,
You haven't got them yet.
Well, I haven't gotten questions yet.
Okay.
Put this way.
This still time for a few questions. Well, it was a great tribute to your mother. That you sounded so shocked that Bill Gates had spent several hundreds of dollars on books on memory.
Yes.
That must have ruined the library budget.
Yes. Well, I thought I would be so condescending and clever, and there they were. You know.
I'll listen to questions.
No questions? I guess I've either answered people. Oh, well, there's one person there, and then one, yes. Yes. Yes, it was strange. Yes. Well, he acted as the architect felt. The architect seemed to not have seen it as a mistake. He acted very much, as I have noticed other times, that they're playing with how to balance that sense of, shall we say, predestination and free will, or whatever you want to call it. So I meant it that way, but he was well aware of it. He didn't seem at all surprised, which struck me.
So that's an example of a modern labyrinth.
Well, to generate the sensation of labyrinth. I think labyrinth is more like a state of mind than, you know what I mean? I realize that it may not be a labyrinth to you, right? You probably say, that's garbage, let's go home. You know, but someone else might say, oh, let's gamble, you know, that kind of thing.
So you made an analogy to the sculpture in Barcelona.
Sculpture where, I'm sorry?
In the Barcelona.
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, that's interesting. It's a logical, yes. Basic difference.
It seemed like in the Barcelona pavilion, everything was so studied and there's so superior order that the majority of the people walking around we are on it's actually that superior order or perfection that makes us lose ourselves in this labyrinth.
Could be. Or maybe the Barcelona Pavilion isn't a good example of this particular model of scripted space, which, you know, well, not for you. Dude, I'm trying to not over-prescribe before I know enough.
No, I'm just trying to see what,
Yes. Well, what would you say? How would you describe, well, maybe we need another model, you see? Maybe we need a different way to examine. I mean, if you look at the design, right? And the program, in other words, the client, essentially, right? And then the reception, maybe there are other models that need to be set up as well. I'm trying not to to pretend that I'm a dictionary, you know. I'm trying to, because I realize there are so many factors. Also, my last book, The History of Forgetting, was about erasure and the fact that people can't possibly even know what goes on in anyone's mind when they're in a space, you know. So here, I'm trying not to be too objective, right? Or to over-objectify, but I'm opening up what I'm hoping could be a mode of discourse, right? A way to discuss these problems so that we can evolve, right? More complicated strategies. So I don't want to defend. I'd rather be educated back, so to speak. And so I'll have to think about that. And then I would do the same. What I would want to do is go over each of the steps. I feel that I don't trust myself walking through a shopping mall or whatever it is. I don't feel superior to it anymore. I mean, I look at a surveillance camera and someone says, surveillance camera. And then I always nudge them and said, but there's nothing in the camera. How do you know? I said, how do you know there is? How do you know there's anyone watching? How do you know there's anyone caring? Maybe they put the camera here because it's cheaper than having some poor fool stare at you, right? How do you know? How did you get so psychic? What mind meld, right? What sort of profundity has allowed you to see so much? You know what I mean? Because I can't. I mean, I'm always amazed at you know how these things operate. So it's indeed very complicated. And also, my feeling is that greed is not efficient. It just makes money. You know. So it doesn't mean that they've done a good job or a bad job. It means they've attempted to do a job to make money. You know, or to succeed. So I expect redundancy. I anticipate the ridiculous. And then you know you're not going to be completely disappointed. but I learned not to underestimate in any way the process of shall we say, learning by trial and error, right? And then also the incredible shrewdness, you know, that can exist. And finally, the fact that there is a commitment and that this is an evolving system with or without us. It's almost as if either it will evolve whether we help it or not. That sort of thing. Is that not perfect but suitable? Oh yes.
Oh yeah, hi. You said something about the question of taste at the beginning. When you were talking about what you believe scripted space to be, which is the viewer's space, a space to be navigated by the viewer.
Yeah, where you clearly can see inside the space that they're inviting you to go through a process by which you are either achieving salvation or finding your way to Mickey or whatever. Yes.
But you mentioned taste also, so I'm wondering, do you mean it's a viewer's taste, so the viewer says, okay, I want to take this route rather than that route? Because then, later, you're talking about architects designing these highly controlled spaces,
Yes.
highly manipulative spaces.
Yes,
Are you
it's
therefore talking about the architect's taste?
well, first of all, as we know, sometimes the architects will design something and the client will say, screw it, you know. We won't go ahead with this.
The client has accepted it,
Yes.
and wants the user
Yes.
using it.
Well, I'll give you an example of the curiosity. Let's take Disneyland. When Disneyland opened, Main Street was a kind of memento mori. In other words, it was a memento mori because as of 1955 in the summer, Main Streets were dying, and in a sense, it was at 7/8 scale to give you a sense of omnipotent control. I was talking with someone about that. You know, a sense of childish control. Anything out of scale sort of plays into childhood, either you in control or you being controlled, that sort of thing. And there was something fascinating about being in a space that you might say, oh my God, they're going, but Ohio is losing them. Or something. I mean, it's a kind of nostalgia at the moment. That was 1955. By 1965, it had lost that magic entirely. And people saying, oh, it's boring, it looks like a bad movie, you know what I mean, that sort of thing. So they have to recondition it. So taste is not only a variable, it's an endless variable, you know. And impulse is also difficult to imagine. And consider, they're trying to make it seem so casual, so friendly, and yet what is more fragile than impulse itself? That you might walk and say something like, nah, screw Disneyland, let's just go to the beach, you know? Or forget it. Who wants to go to Piccadilly? What the hell is that mess? You know, I don't want to go there. Let's go here. Let's go to this restaurant. Let's go to that place. I don't want to take the train. I don't want to drive. You know, whatever it might be. So they're trying to. It's an incredibly neurotic process, right? Trying to ascertain taste or even define taste. So I would say it's actually a war of nerves that has to appear very, very casual, as if there's no effort at all. It's effortless paranoia, right? On their part.
Taste.
What? The way they're trying to match meat taste, yeah. So I'm realizing how incredibly fragile that process is, and heads roll all the time. Isn't that right? Look at the film industry. You know, or don't look at the film industry, whatever you choose. But the incredible paranoia. You know, oh no, a bug. But there was already a bug cartoon. Oh, what do we do? Will this bug cartoon match that bug cartoon? You know, that kind of thing. Oh no! Oh, another Armageddon. Oh, they're blowing up the world the same way in two films, and we both. I mean, how do they market? Maybe people want to see the world blown up again. You know, which apparently they did. Armageddon did very well. You know, that sort of thing. So taste is a kind of battlefield, particularly in a culture where increasingly everything is marketed and advertised, including war, right? And in the United States, the president's private parts, you know, which became a kind of negotiable object, if you will, you know, and it was just incredible, the marketing of Penisgate, as I call it, you know, whatever it is. I mean, because every year in public television, through television, they have to give you free time because television is more alive when it's minute-to-minute coverage than at any other time. So every year there has to be an event in American television, if possible, where you just get hooked. And then after you get hooked, then you'll watch more, and then the advertising grows. So they thought, wow, the president. Oh my! You know, so the whole networks devoted wall-to-wall coverage of his penis, essentially. I mean, what else can you call it? You know, and for months and months on end, and the public didn't even care, and yet somehow they must have been watching because they were checking the ratings. So you wonder, is this making public taste, playing with public taste? You know what I mean? How peculiar it is indeed. But yet they know that each year, because the number of people watching television is going down, it's sloping downward. They have to sort of reinfect you with television. So they use these public events that way. I mean, and we know this. So taste is a battleground, right? That has now reached the pinnacle of political importance. It nearly changed the entire constitutional relationship between branches of government in the United States. I mean, how much more serious can it get? Just because they needed moments for you to watch, you know. So yeah, I don't know if that's an answer precisely. Have I answered?
Okay, well,
I'm sorry.
I think we're just about finished, and I would like to thank Norman for coming here to speak. But before we do actually finish, I'd like to reveal that Norman was actually invited recently to the headquarters of Microsoft. And just as a way of finishing, I'd like you to tell him how he was greeted by the woman.
Yeah, that was in '96 or something. Yeah, I walked in to this sort of atomic unit where they work together, and the woman shook my hand, and she simply shook my hand and said, "You will not work here." Right? It's just like that. Oh, was that useful?
Kim.
Oh, hi. I hope you had fun.
I did. I'm sorry. I'm so bad.